The white sedan screeched to a stop, inches from Nora Bellamy's knees, close enough that she felt the heat of the engine against her bare legs, close enough that the terrified cat in her arms yowled and clawed instinctively against her chest. Rafael De Luca sat frozen behind the wheel, waiting for the screaming, the threats, the outstretched palm demanding money, the way every other near miss on this street had gone before. Instead, Nora sank to her knees on the pavement, clutching her sister's cat, and wept as though the world had just ended a second time. Nora had crossed that street 100 times before, without incident, carrying groceries or laundry, or, most days, nothing more than the tired weight of a double shift at the Regency Hotel, where she worked as a maid, changing linens and scrubbing bathrooms for guests who rarely looked at her twice. That particular afternoon she carried Milo, her sister's white cat, wrapped snugly in a towel after a visit to the low-cost clinic 3 blocks from her apartment. His checkup finished, his vaccinations current. Nothing about the day suggesting it would end in chaos on a crowded sidewalk. Nora had grown up the older sister in a household where money was always tight, learning early to stretch every dollar and to find joy in small, ordinary things, rather than the material comforts other families around her seemed to take for granted. That upbringing had shaped her into someone who noticed kindness readily and distrusted anything that seemed too polished or too convenient, an instinct that would prove useful in the strange weeks ahead, though she had no way of knowing that yet as she carried Milo down that crowded sidewalk. Milo had belonged to Nora's younger sister, Elena, for the better part of 3 years before Elena's sudden death, 8 months earlier, left Nora as the cat's only remaining family. Nora had never considered herself much of an animal person before that, but the moment she carried the frightened, grieving cat out of Elena's empty apartment, something in her had decided, without any real deliberation, that she would keep him safe for as long as she possibly could, regardless of what her own modest income could actually afford. She worked extra shifts at the hotel to cover his food and his vet visits, skipped meals more often than she liked to admit, and told herself, on the hardest nights, that Milo's steady purring against her chest was worth every sacrifice, because he was the last living piece of Elena she had left in the world. Elena had died suddenly, the official report calling it a tragic accident, during a late shift at the small logistics company where she had worked briefly before her death, though something about the explanation had never quite settled easily in Nora's chest. She had asked around discreetly in the months following Elena's death, speaking to a few of her sister's old co-workers, who offered only vague, uncomfortable answers whenever she raised the subject of Elena's final weeks at the company. Answers that felt, to Nora, more like people avoiding a topic than people who genuinely knew nothing worth sharing. She had eventually let the questions go, telling herself grief was making her suspicious of an ordinary tragedy, though the unease never fully left her. Rafael De Luca had been driving through that particular stretch of the city, on his way to a meeting he considered more important than almost anything else on his calendar that week, distracted by a phone call from his financial advisor, Adrian Voss, about a discrepancy in one of his company's quarterly reports. He barely registered the pedestrian crossing sign until Nora stepped directly into his path, and by the time he slammed the brakes, the car had already clipped close enough to send Milo's carrier bag skidding from her grip. Adrian's voice on the other end of the call had carried its usual measured calm, the same steady professionalism that had made him one of Raphael's most trusted advisors over the past decade. Though in hindsight, once the full truth eventually surfaced, Raphael would recall a faint, uncharacteristic tension in his tone that afternoon, one he had dismissed at the time as simple stress over quarterly numbers. Raphael's convoy, 2 black SUVs trailing his sedan with the practiced discipline of men who had learned never to react visibly to anything in public, slowed to a stop behind him, several of his security detail already reaching for their doors, prepared for whatever confrontation typically followed an incident involving their employer's reputation. What they were not prepared for was Nora rising from the pavement, cradling the injured cat against her chest, and marching directly toward Raphael's window with a fury that made even his hardened guards hesitate before intervening. She pounded her open palm against the glass, demanding he look at what he had nearly done, her voice carrying easily across the crowded sidewalk where onlookers had already begun gathering, phones rising to capture whatever confrontation was about to unfold between an ordinary woman and a man whose black sedan and silent, watchful entourage made his importance obvious even to strangers who had no idea exactly who he was. Raphael rolled down his window slowly, his expression unreadable, prepared for the demands he assumed were coming. The onlookers gathered on the sidewalk murmured among themselves, several recognizing the sleek black convoy as belonging to someone important, though none of them could have guessed exactly how significant this particular altercation would eventually prove to be, filing away the scene as little more than an unusual moment of street drama before drifting back to their own afternoons. Nora did not ask for money. She did not threaten a lawsuit or scream obscenities the way Raphael had come to expect from anyone unfortunate enough to cross paths with his convoy on a public street. She simply stood there, cradling Milo, and told him, her voice cracking with a grief that had nothing to do with the near miss itself, that this cat was the only thing she had left of her dead sister, and that if Raphael had killed him, he would have taken away the last piece of Elena that still remained in this world. The words landed on Raphael with a force considerably heavier than the accusation itself warranted, something in his controlled expression shifting almost imperceptibly as an old, carefully buried memory surfaced without permission. 11 years earlier, driving recklessly through a rain-slicked intersection after a bitter argument with his older brother, Raphael had lost control of his car and struck a vehicle carrying his brother's fiancée, a woman named Isabel who died at the scene before paramedics could reach her, a tragedy Raphael had never once discussed openly with anyone in the years since. Isabel had been kind to him in ways he rarely allowed himself to remember clearly, a warmth in his family's life that his own reckless choice had extinguished in a single instant, leaving behind a silence at every holiday gathering afterward that no one in his family ever quite found the words to address directly. His brother had never fully forgiven him, and Raphael had spent over a decade building an empire that let him control every variable in his life precisely because that single moment of reckless carelessness had taught him how quickly an ordinary mistake could destroy everything that mattered. He had told himself for years that attachment invited exactly this kind of catastrophic loss, that distance and control were the only reliable protections against ever again causing the kind of grief he saw now, raw and unguarded, on the face of a stranger crying over an injured cat. Milo whimpered weakly in Nora's arms, a thin line of blood visible along his rear leg where the car's mirror had grazed him during the near collision, and the sight of the injured animal seemed to finally break through whatever calculation had been running behind Raphael's eyes since Nora first began speaking. Without a word of explanation to his stunned security detail, he opened his car door, stepped directly into the crowded street, and held out his arms, asking Nora, quietly and without any of the command his men were accustomed to hearing from him, to let him help get the cat somewhere it could be treated. His security detail exchanged uncertain glances among themselves, none of them quite able to reconcile the composed, controlled man they answered to every day with the figure now kneeling on hot pavement in a tailored suit, gently examining an injured animal's leg with more tenderness than any of them had ever witnessed him extend toward another person, let alone a stranger's pet. Nora hesitated, staring at the man who moments earlier had nearly killed the only family she had left, uncertain whether to trust the sudden shift in his demeanor or read it as some calculated maneuver she did not yet understand. But Milo's soft, pained mewing decided the matter for her faster than any deliberation could have, and she allowed Raphael to gently take the injured cat from her arms, his large, tattooed hands surprisingly careful as he cradled the trembling animal against his chest. Raphael turned to his stunned security detail and ordered the entire convoy to follow Nora to whatever emergency veterinary clinic she chose, his voice carrying none of its usual controlled authority, replaced instead by something closer to urgent, unguarded concern that none of his men had witnessed from him in years of service. His driver, recovering quickly from his own shock, pulled the car forward at Nora's direction toward an emergency clinic 6 blocks away, the black SUVs trailing obediently behind, despite none of the guards fully understanding what had just transformed their employer into someone they barely recognized. At the clinic, Raphael refused to simply hand Milo off to the intake staff and retreat to his car the way any of his security detail might have expected. He remained in the crowded waiting room, still dressed in his tailored suit, sitting rigidly upright in a plastic chair meant for anxious pet owners, refusing every offer his men made to reschedule his business meeting or handle the situation on his behalf. Nora watched him from across the room, unable to reconcile the reputation she had heard whispered about this man with the strange, patient vigil he was keeping over an animal he had never met before that afternoon. The clinic's waiting room filled and emptied around them several times over those 2 hours, other pet owners glancing curiously at the tattooed, clearly wealthy man sitting rigidly among them, though none dared approach given the 2 watchful guards stationed discreetly near the entrance, their presence alone enough to discourage casual conversation from anyone who might have otherwise wondered why such a man was waiting so patiently in an ordinary neighborhood clinic. She asked him quietly, during the long wait for news from the operating room, why a man with his reputation and his obvious schedule was still sitting in a veterinary clinic waiting room instead of sending his people to handle it and moving on with his day. Raphael did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the closed door leading toward the clinic's treatment area, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar weight that made Nora set aside, for the moment, whatever anger still lingered from the accident itself. He told her only that he understood, better than she could possibly know, what it meant to nearly cause an irreversible loss through carelessness, and that leaving before knowing the cat would be all right felt, to him, like a debt he could not walk away from, regardless of how inconvenient the wait proved to his schedule. Nora studied him carefully after that admission, sensing there was considerably more beneath the surface of his words than he was willing to share with a stranger, though she did not press him further in that moment. The veterinarian emerged nearly 2 hours later with reassuring news. Milo's leg wound required only cleaning and a few stitches, no permanent damage, though the cat would need to remain overnight for observation, given the stress of the accident. As the technician removed Milo's damaged collar to properly examine the injury beneath it, something inside the collar's worn lining caught against the exam table's edge, tearing slightly and revealing a small, hard object hidden carefully within the fabric that had clearly been sewn into place, deliberately, rather than lost there by accident. Nora stared at the small object as the technician handed it over, a tiny data storage device no larger than a fingernail, its casing stamped with a small, distinctive symbol she did not immediately recognize. Raphael, standing close enough to see it clearly, went suddenly, visibly still, his eyes narrowing on the symbol, with an intensity that made Nora's earlier confusion sharpen into genuine alarm. He asked her, his voice tight and controlled once more, where exactly the cat's collar had come from, and how long Milo had been wearing it. Elena had always been the more sentimental of the 2 sisters, prone to keeping small mementos of every important moment in her life, a trait that had once mildly exasperated Nora during their shared childhood, but that now, in hindsight, made perfect sense of why her sister might have chosen something as personal and overlooked as a beloved cat's collar to hide something she considered too dangerous to keep anywhere more obvious. Nora explained, her mind racing to catch up with whatever recognition had just moved across Raphael's face, that the collar had belonged to Milo since before her sister's death, that she had never once thought to replace it because it still fit him well, and Elena had chosen it herself. Raphael turned the small device over carefully in his palm, studying the symbol stamped into its casing, and told her, with a controlled calm that did little to mask the tension building beneath it, that this symbol belonged to one of his own logistics subsidiaries, the same company coincidentally or not, where Nora's sister had once briefly worked. The revelation landed between them, with the weight of something neither of them fully understood yet, but both instinctively recognized as significant. Nora explained, her voice unsteady now, that Elena had worked at that company for barely 3 months before her death, that she had seemed increasingly anxious in her final weeks, mentioning vaguely to Nora that she had discovered something at work that troubled her deeply, though she had never explained exactly what, and had died in what the official report called a tragic accident, only days after that last unsettling conversation. Nora remembered, with a fresh pang of grief, the last phone call she had shared with Elena before her death, a conversation cut short by Nora's own exhaustion after a long hotel shift, her sister's voice carrying an anxious edge Nora had chalked up at the time to ordinary job stress rather than anything genuinely dangerous, a mistake she had replayed in her mind countless times since. Raphael absorbed this information with a stillness that unsettled Nora more than any outward display of anger could have, his mind clearly working through implications he was not yet ready to voice aloud. He told her plainly that he needed to know what was stored on that device, that a hidden data drive stitched secretly into a cat's collar, connected to his own company, and to a woman who had died under circumstances that suddenly seemed considerably less accidental than the official report suggested, was not something he could simply walk away from and forget. Nora's grip on the small device tightened instinctively, an old protective instinct rising in her that had nothing to do with corporate secrets or hidden data, and everything to do with the fact that this object, whatever it contained, was the last physical thing her sister had touched before her death. She told Raphael plainly that she would not simply surrender it to him, a man she had met only hours earlier under violent circumstances, regardless of what connection it might have to his business interests. Raphael did not argue the point, or attempt to take the device by force, an option his men would have expected him to consider without hesitation, under nearly any other circumstance. Instead, he proposed something that surprised even him as the words left his mouth, that they investigate its contents together, that whatever her sister had discovered inside his own organization deserved a thorough, honest accounting, and that Nora, as the person who trusted the device least in his hands, should remain present for every step of uncovering what it actually contained. Nora considered the offer carefully, aware that partnering with a man whose reckless driving had nearly killed her cat hours earlier carried obvious risks she could not fully calculate yet. But something in his genuine, uncharacteristic patience throughout the afternoon, the way he had waited through 2 hours in an uncomfortable waiting room chair rather than simply delegating the entire situation to his staff, convinced her that whatever guilt or grief was moving beneath his controlled exterior was genuine rather than calculated. She agreed to work with him on the condition that the device remained in her possession throughout. The technician Raphael eventually brought in specialized in exactly this kind of delicate data recovery, a quiet, methodical woman named Priya, who asked no questions about why a man of Raphael's obvious standing needed her particular expertise, applied to a device pulled from inside a cat's collar, simply doing her work with the same professional discretion Raphael had come to value in every specialist he trusted with sensitive matters. Over the following days, Raphael arranged for a trusted technician outside his usual staff, someone with no connection to the company where Elena had worked, to carefully extract and decode the device's contents without alerting anyone inside his organization who might have reason to interfere. Nora insisted on being present for every session, watching lines of financial data and internal correspondence slowly resolve into something considerably more damning than either of them had initially expected to find. Raphael found himself increasingly unable to view the mounting evidence with his usual detached, strategic distance, each new document deepening a suspicion he did not yet want to voice aloud, that the theft implicated someone considerably closer to him than any outside contractor or minor employee could have managed. He kept returning, almost compulsively, to which members of his inner circle held enough authority over that particular subsidiary to move money so quietly for so long without detection. The records revealed a pattern of financial theft, running through the logistics subsidiary, over nearly 2 years, funds diverted through falsified shipping manifests and inflated vendor invoices, carefully hidden behind layers of legitimate-looking paperwork that would have taken a genuinely thorough audit to uncover. Elena, working in the company's records department during her brief 3 months there, had apparently stumbled onto the discrepancies during a routine filing task, noticing patterns that did not match the official numbers she had been trained to expect. Nora recognized, reading through the decoded files, small notations in the margins of several documents that matched her sister's distinctive handwriting, questions and calculations Elena had clearly worked through privately before deciding, evidently, to hide the evidence somewhere she believed would remain safe, sewn secretly into her own cat's collar, rather than reported through official channels she may have already begun to distrust. The discovery struck Nora with a fresh wave of grief, understanding now that her sister had likely been carrying real fear in those final weeks, fear she had never fully shared with anyone. Nora found herself, during those long evenings of careful document review, growing genuinely curious about the man sitting across from her, noticing the way his sharp business instincts occasionally softened into something more contemplative whenever their conversation drifted away from the investigation itself and toward smaller, more personal territory neither of them had originally intended to explore together. Working alongside Raphael through those difficult days of discovery revealed something neither of them had anticipated feeling toward the other. He found himself genuinely drawn to Nora's stubborn refusal to simply defer to his authority or his wealth, the way she challenged his assumptions and insisted on understanding every detail of the investigation rather than trusting him to handle it on her behalf. Nora, for her part, began noticing the careful, controlled man behind the fearsome reputation, someone clearly carrying a private weight he had never learned how to set down. One evening, reviewing financial records late enough that the small office Raphael had arranged for their investigation had grown quiet around them, Nora asked him directly what exactly he had meant, back at the veterinary clinic, about understanding what it meant to nearly cause an irreversible loss through carelessness. Raphael considered the question for a long moment, before finally telling her the story he had kept buried for over a decade. The rain-slicked intersection, the bitter argument with his brother, the reckless speed that had ended Isabel's life and fractured his family beyond any repair he had ever managed to offer. Nora listened without interrupting, recognizing in his careful, halting account the same particular grief she carried for Elena, grief tangled inextricably with guilt over things that could never be undone or fully explained away. She told him, when he finished, that she understood now why he had refused to leave that waiting room, why the sight of an injured animal and a grieving stranger had cracked through whatever careful distance he usually maintained, because some losses simply refused to stay buried, no matter how thoroughly a person tried to control every variable of their life afterward. The investigation reached a critical point when the decoded records pointed increasingly toward someone deeply embedded in Raphael's trusted inner circle, someone with enough authority over the logistics subsidiary's finances to orchestrate the theft convincingly, and enough proximity to have learned that Elena had discovered the pattern before her sudden, suspicious death. Raphael's financial advisor, Adrian Voss, had overseen that particular subsidiary for years, and the deeper Nora and Raphael dug, the more the evidence seemed to circle back toward decisions only someone in Adrian's position could have made. Adrian had joined Raphael's organization over a decade earlier, initially hired for his sharp analytical mind and his apparent willingness to work within the careful, disciplined structure Raphael demanded of everyone close to him, rising steadily through the ranks until he oversaw nearly every major financial decision across Raphael's legitimate business holdings, a position of trust that had made him, until this investigation, virtually above suspicion in Raphael's mind. Raphael confronted Adrian directly, laying the decoded records across his desk without preamble, watching the calm, loyal expression his advisor had maintained for over a decade finally crack under the weight of evidence, too specific to explain away as coincidence. Adrian did not deny the theft outright, but he offered Raphael an uncomfortable truth in return, one that reframed the entire tragedy in a way neither Raphael nor Nora had anticipated confronting. Adrian explained that the financial pressures driving the theft had originated years earlier, from decisions Raphael himself had made during the same reckless period of his life that had ended Isabel's death, expansion moves and hasty acquisitions undertaken during his grief and guilt that had left several of his subsidiaries financially overextended, creating exactly the kind of strained conditions that made embezzlement both tempting and, for a time, difficult to detect through normal channels. Raphael's own past decisions, made during a period he had spent years trying not to examine too closely, had indirectly helped create the vulnerability Elena stumbled into. The revelation struck Raphael harder than the original discovery of the theft itself, forcing him to confront not only Adrian's betrayal, but his own indirect role in the chain of events that had ultimately cost Elena her life. His first instinct, raw and immediate, was fury, a desire to see Adrian and anyone else involved punished with the same ruthless efficiency his reputation had always promised, a desire Nora watched building in him with growing alarm. As the confrontation threatened to spiral toward violence neither of them could take back. The two guards stationed outside Adrian's office that afternoon exchanged uneasy glances through the glass door, sensing the confrontation escalating, but under strict orders not to intervene unless Raphael explicitly signaled otherwise, an instruction that left them watching helplessly as tension built toward something neither of them wanted to witness unfold. Nora stepped between Raphael and the door Adrian had backed toward, telling him plainly that revenge would not bring Elena back, would not honor the sister who had died trying to expose wrongdoing rather than profit from it, and would only prove that nothing had actually changed in him since the reckless anger that had taken Isabel's life all those years earlier. She told him that real accountability looked considerably different from violence, that exposing the truth and protecting whoever else remained endangered by Adrian's scheme mattered infinitely more than satisfying his own fury in the moment. Raphael stood frozen for a long moment, caught between the violent instinct his entire empire had been built upon and the woman in front of him asking him to choose something considerably harder. He lowered the hand that had been reaching, almost unconsciously, toward the weapon he always carried, and told Adrian instead that he would face full legal consequences for the theft, that federal investigators would be contacted with the complete evidence Nora and Raphael had assembled, and that any attempt to flee or interfere with that process would be met with considerably less mercy than he was currently being offered. Adrian's cooperation, once he understood that Raphael intended to pursue legal consequences rather than the violent retaliation his organization's reputation might have predicted, proved considerably more thorough than either Raphael or Nora had expected, providing federal investigators with detailed records of every transaction and every falsified document he had constructed over nearly 2 years, evidence that ultimately protected several smaller vendors who had unknowingly been implicated in the scheme's paper trail. In the days that followed, Raphael worked with law enforcement to ensure the embezzlement scheme was properly investigated and prosecuted, providing complete access to the decoded records and testifying personally about the pattern of theft his own financial advisor had orchestrated over nearly 2 years. He made no attempt to minimize his own role in creating the conditions that had allowed the scheme to flourish, publicly acknowledging the reckless expansion decisions from his past that had left the subsidiary vulnerable in the first place, an admission his security detail had never once heard him make about anything. Milo recovered fully within a few weeks, his leg healing cleanly, his fear of car engines fading gradually under Nora's patient care, though he developed, to Raphael's quiet amusement, a habit of curling up specifically in whatever chair Raphael happened to be sitting in during his increasingly frequent visits to Nora's small apartment. Nora noticed the cat's growing comfort around a man who had, months earlier, nearly ended his life, and found herself thinking that perhaps healing worked in strange, unpredictable ways for every creature capable of carrying grief. She teased Raphael once, watching Milo settle possessively into his lap for the third evening in a row, that the cat clearly held better judgment about people than most of the guests who stayed at her hotel, and Raphael, laughing in a way that visibly surprised even him, admitted he had never once in his adult life been so thoroughly claimed by anything as small and stubborn as a white cat with a scarred back leg. Raphael's relationship with Nora deepened slowly across those weeks, built not on the drama of their initial collision, but on the accumulated weight of honest conversations, shared grief carefully unpacked between two people who had each spent years believing loss was something to be controlled rather than survived. He told her one evening months after the confrontation with Adrian that he had finally called his brother for the first time in nearly a decade, offering an apology he had avoided delivering for years out of fear it would never be accepted. Nora, in turn, found herself slowly allowing Elena's memory to become something other than an open wound she guarded fiercely against ever healing. She began speaking about her sister more freely, sharing small, warm memories with Raphael that had nothing to do with the tragedy of her death, understanding gradually that honoring Elena did not require holding her loss at the center of every waking thought, that her sister would have wanted her to keep living rather than remain permanently trapped in grief. 140 years ago, they created Lone Star Beer. Raphael, understanding by then exactly what mattered most to Nora beyond any grand romantic gesture his wealth could easily provide, did not offer her a mansion or a life of luxury removed from the modest apartment she had always called home. Instead, he quietly arranged funding for the small animal shelter Elena had once dreamed of opening before her death, a project Nora had mentioned only once, in passing, during one of their long evenings sorting through her sister's old notebooks, never expecting Raphael to have remembered the detail at all. He presented the plans to her on a quiet afternoon months after Adrian's arrest, watching her reaction carefully as she recognized her sister's own handwritten sketches for the shelter's layout, preserved among Elena's belongings, and now transformed into an actual architectural plan bearing her sister's original vision. Nora's tears, this time, carried none of the raw grief that had first drawn Raphael's attention on that crowded street months earlier, but something considerably gentler, the particular relief of watching a lost person's dream finally take shape in the world. The shelter opened its doors 6 months later, named quietly after Elena, staffed partly by Nora herself, alongside a small team of dedicated volunteers, funded discreetly enough that no press attention ever traced the generous donation back to Raphael DeLuca's name. Milo served, in his own small way, as the shelter's unofficial mascot, greeting visitors from his favorite perch near the front window, entirely unaware of how thoroughly his damaged collar had once unraveled a conspiracy and rebuilt 2 broken lives in the process. On opening day, Nora stood in the small courtyard behind the shelter, watching the first families arrive to meet the animals waiting for homes, and felt, for the first time since Elena's death, something closer to peace than grief settle over the memory of her sister. She had spent months believing the only way to honor Elena was to keep her loss sharp and unresolved, and standing there now, surrounded by exactly the kind of quiet, hopeful work her sister had always dreamed of doing, she finally understood how wrong that belief had been. Raphael never fully abandoned the careful control that had defined his life for over a decade, the habit too deeply ingrained after years of building an empire on precisely that discipline. But he learned, slowly and deliberately, to let vulnerability exist alongside that control, rather than treating it as a weakness to be eliminated entirely. His relationship with his brother remained a work in progress, built one honest conversation at a time, though the reconciliation itself felt, to Raphael, like proof that even the oldest wounds could begin healing once someone finally stopped running from them. A year after the near collision that first brought them together, Nora occasionally walked past the intersection where Raphael's car had nearly struck her, and found she no longer flinched at the memory the way she once had. understanding now that the worst moment of that particular afternoon had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become the beginning of something considerably better than either of them could have anticipated standing on that crowded sidewalk. She still carried Elena's memory close, but it had become, exactly as she had once hoped it might, a reason to keep building forward rather than a wound she carried alone, and the shelter, bearing her sister's name, stood now as living proof of exactly that. Raphael, for his part, kept a small, worn photograph of Isabel in his desk drawer now, no longer hidden away entirely but acknowledged quietly as part of the history that had shaped him, alongside a newer photograph Nora had given him of Elena, smiling brightly beside a much younger Milo in a photograph taken years before either of them had any reason to imagine their lives would someday intersect through a frightened cat and a reckless afternoon on a crowded city street. Sometimes, on quiet evenings at the shelter after the volunteers had gone home, Nora would find Raphael sitting on the floor near Milo's favorite window perch, scratching the old cat's ears while the last of the afternoon light slanted through the glass, and she would think, watching the two of them together, that grief had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become the strangest and most honest kind of introduction two people could have ever asked for,